Picture this scenario on NATO's eastern edge. Narva, a quiet Estonian city right on the Russian border. Unmarked operatives flood the streets, stirring up unrest and claiming local Russian speakers are under attack. Then the announcement from Moscow. Putin is sending forces to protect them. Before NATO allies can even agree on how to respond, Russian armour crosses the checkpoint. What happens next could change the world overnight. Military officers warn this may not be a hypothetical exercise. They believe Europe's most dangerous moment won't come during the war in Ukraine. It will come in the years right after a peace deal. It's led defence planners to pinpoint one specific looming deadline for when the threat reaches its peak: 2030. For months, European capitals have been fixated on this single year. Look at how quickly European military leaders locked onto this timeline.
Russia could be ready to use military force against NATO within 5 years.
There could be an attack by Russia on NATO as soon as 2030.
British Army chiefs recently held a war game in London. The year for the mock exercise? 2030, where the threat from Russia is expected to be at its most acute. Intelligence services across the alliance, from Germany and Estonia to Denmark and the United States, share a strikingly similar assessment. They estimate it will take Russia anywhere between 3 to 8 years to restore its military power to a level capable of striking a neighbouring NATO country. Look at what Germany's top military commander revealed about where Russia's new weapons are actually going. General Carsten Breuer warned that while Russia is mass-producing military hardware at record speed, it isn't sending all of it to the Ukrainian front lines. Instead, Moscow is actively holding weapons back, stockpiling armour and re-equipping its forces for a potentially much broader, long-term confrontation with the West. But is Russia actually planning an invasion in 4 years? Or is 2030 a deadline for the West? Analysts at the Royal United Services Institute point out a critical distinction between being ready to attack and actually planning a move. It suggests the date might be less about Russian intent and more about Western necessity. There is generally a view that it could rebuild land forces to be fairly threatening in only a few years. Therefore, NATO seniors have tried to pick a realistic target that says we need to be able to improve our conventional defence within this time. 2030 then is simply the realistic target NATO needs to rearm before Russia can rebuild its own forces. So if 2030 is a race to rearm, what happens to Putin's army when a ceasefire is finally signed in Ukraine? Peace in Ukraine offers up something of a paradox. The war there would come to an end, but it might actually make Europe less secure in the short term. Without the daily attrition of the Ukrainian front, Russia can redirect its state resources away from immediate battlefield survival and towards stockpiling weapons and modernising its forces. NATO members are concerned that without a war draining its resources, Russia would be in a much better place to prepare for a potential confrontation with the alliance, pointing again to a timeline around 2030. Meanwhile, the Russian military-industrial complex has scaled up massively. Despite suffering approximately 1 million casualties to date, the Kremlin remains committed to an ambitious goal, expanding the Russian army to 1.5 million active duty personnel. This expansion would make the Russian army the second largest in the entire world, eclipsed only by China's. In 2025, the Kremlin launched a massive autumn conscription drive that drafted 135,000 people, one of the largest call-ups in more than a decade. About 70% of the state budget is being poured into security-related expenditures, entirely at the expense of the regular economy. In other words, where would all of the Russian forces and weaponry go? Reversing a 70% security budget is nearly impossible for the Kremlin to do quickly. According to a senior NATO official, this trend means one of two things. Either Russia has no plans for lasting peace in Ukraine, or its aggressive force posture towards NATO borders will continue long term.
If Russia's army is big, if their military budget is as big as it is right now, they will want to use it again.
There is also the issue of Western sanctions, which would likely remain regardless of any peace deal with Ukraine. Before 2020, many Western European nations believed that deep economic ties, particularly Europe's reliance on Russian energy, would prevent a major war. That bridge has now been burned. Because Russia's economy is now decoupled from the West and insulated by Chinese markets, the threat of future Western economic sanctions has lost its deterrent value. Simply put, Russia has much less to lose economically by provoking or attacking a NATO member. Putin will have a heavily militarised state he can't afford to wind down, parked right on NATO's doorstep, and Russia has already begun to test NATO's resolve. A full-scale invasion of NATO is likely to be suicidal, and Moscow knows it. An attack on one member brings the full force of the 32-nation alliance. A senior NATO official told reporters recently, Moscow is massively overstretched by the conflict in Ukraine, and the Kremlin knows that NATO would respond forcefully to an attack on any member state. Russia is deterred because of the actions that we are taking. So instead of launching a war they can't win, Russia is operating in a grey zone, testing how much chaos they can cause without triggering a military response.
Moscow is trying to weaken Europe without crossing the threshold of open warfare. From cyber attacks to sabotage and drone incursions, we have seen reckless and deliberate escalation.
Look at what is already happening along Europe's borders. Russian jets are deliberately violating Polish, Romanian and Estonian airspace. At the same time, covert networks hired by Russia are orchestrating arson attacks and sabotage across the continent.
These attacks are the result of a coordinated campaign to destabilize our societies and discourage us from supporting Ukraine.
It gives credence to the fears in Poland and the Baltic states. Russia is deliberately testing the cohesion of the Western alliance, probing for weaknesses without triggering an all-out war. The real danger is that these low-level attacks will break NATO's unity. If that happens, Russia might rebuild its army by 2030 and decide NATO is too divided to stop a small, direct invasion. However, despite Russia's reckless behaviour, a NATO official said he believes the alliance has stopped a direct attack so far simply by standing united. So what does this all mean for the countdown to 2030? Right now, Russia is heavily overstretched in Ukraine and lacks the capacity to open a second front. If Moscow attempted a land grab in the Baltics today, Ukraine would immediately move to reclaim its lost territory. But the clock is ticking. The years leading up to 2030 represent a closing window for NATO to prove its conventional deterrence is real.